I just took the thumbnail photo for this video, and I originally wanted to like be holding all the palettes, but that was just mission impossible. So I decided to hold only part of the palettes, and you can still see in that thumbnail that I look absolutely mortified because I have the fakest smile you can ever imagine, because my mind is just going, oh, please don't drop anything, please don't drop anything, please don't drop anything. It is no secret to anyone on this channel that I love talking about eyeshadow and eyeshadow palettes in particular. I can just ramble about that all day, every day, even in my dreams. So when I saw Alice do this tag, I was like, oh my god, I just need to do this tag as soon as possible. So it is the day after and I'm already filming this video. This tag is just called the Eyeshadow Palette Tag, and it was originally created by Samantha and Allie Glines. I'm pretty sure I've seen like iterations of eyeshadow palette tags before, so this is just the newest iteration on eyeshadow palette tags. Okay, question number one. Actually, they're not really formulated as questions, they're just formulated as like little like prompts? I don't know. Show your newest palette. The newest palette in my collection is the Decadence palette from Pat McGrath. Mine is in the limited edition gold packaging because I just got it on a re-release very recently. I'm really happy to have this palette. I hesitated for a long time whether I should buy it because I do own some of these eyeshadows in other eyeshadow palettes or in singles. But in the end I was like, fuck it, you only live once, so I bought the palette. I'm really happy with my decision. You will have probably seen that my previous video is all about this palette, where I also created a look with it. Beautiful colors, gorgeous formula. You guys know Pat McGrath is one of my absolute favorite, if not my absolute favorite brand at the moment, especially in terms of eyeshadows. And yeah, what can I say about this palette other than I really enjoy it? I know that for a lot of people it's a bit of a deal breaker that there are no mattes in this palette, but something that I've also said before is I find Pat McGrath's metallic formula to be so versatile that I don't really mind that there are no mattes in this palette, and if I have to pull out the matte from another palette, that's really not a problem for me. Question number two, show your oldest palette. And I hesitated a little bit whether I still have this palette, but I still do. My oldest palette is this eyeshadow box from Urban Decay. It is an eyeshadow palette from maybe a decade ago or more, and I bought this. It was my first like higher end palette purchase. I purchased this in 2013 and I absolutely loved it when I bought it. It's still beautiful quality actually. If I swatch these eyeshadows, some of them are still just as pigmented and just as like punchy and vibrant as they used to be like 7 years ago. So I don't really use this palette anymore. I keep it around more for sentimental purposes, and because I was actually planning on like panning these two shades, the beautiful green and the blue. I do use these two eyeshadows sometimes as inner corner highlights or like pop of color on my lower lash line, which is the only reason that I've kept this palette around aside from the sentimental value. Next one, show your most expensive palette. Now, you guys know I have a number of Pat McGrath palettes, so those are my most expensive palettes, but I'm going to show you the very first one that I bought, and it was the very first time that I paid so much money for an eyeshadow palette, and that is my beautiful, gorgeous Sublime palette. I love this eyeshadow palette. I waited over a year to buy a Pat McGrath palette, even though I had heard so many people in my like close circle of YouTube friends talk about how much they enjoy the formula, but in the end of the day it seemed so outrageous to me to pay $125 for 10 eyeshadows that I just couldn't fathom what kind of quality these eyeshadows must have to cost this much money. And then I bought the palette and I swatched especially the shadows over here in this corner, and I knew why this palette is so expensive. And I realized that Pat McGrath eyeshadows are not just sublime in terms of their formula, but you're just getting an experience, a new way of applying makeup, a new way of thinking about application of makeup, because before Pat McGrath I never really thought about layering things and layering textures especially, and now layering textures over each other is like one of my favorite things to do in makeup, and that is something I have to thank her eyeshadow palettes for. So that is one of the reasons that I fell in love with the brand, and this is my very first, but not last, as you guys know, eyeshadow palette purchase from Pat McGrath, and these are the most expensive palettes in my collection. Don't worry, I'm not only going to talk about Pat McGrath, these were the only two eyeshadow palettes that I wanted to show from her. So let's move on. Show your most affordable palette. Now, I'm not really sure how much either of these palette costs, but I'm pretty sure that it is a toss between the Just My Luck palette from Colourpop and the NYX Perfect Filter palette in Marine Layer. It is one of these two eyeshadow palettes that's the cheapest one in my collection. Let's talk about the NYX Marine Layer one, because this is the only like drugstore eyeshadow palette that I still have in my collection and I've still kept around. I'm not really sure why. It's not like I can't find any of these eyeshadows in another eyeshadow palette and in a much better formula, but there is something especially about this blue that doesn't let me let go of this palette. It's just so beautiful and so vibrant, and honestly, I've done like several looks with this eyeshadow palette and I've always enjoyed what I've created, and I think that's the reason why I still keep it around. Alright, the next one was a little bit difficult for me because it is Show Your Everyday palette, and there is really no such thing for me as an everyday palette. I pull out a different palette every day. I don't really have restrictions in terms of how I should do my makeup for work, so I'm not restricted to only using like office-friendly neutral eyeshadow palettes when I go to work. So for me, every day is a new eyeshadow palette and there's no such thing as an everyday palette. But a while back, I used to always pull out this palette when I wanted to do something a little bit more neutral and toned down, or I was like, I don't have much time to think about my makeup, so I want to do something simple and neutral. And that is the Naked Heat palette from Urban Decay. It looks like this. When it comes to neutrals, these are the tones that I really enjoy to wear. They're like the more like orangey, warmer, peachy tones. This eyeshadow palette was also an eye-opening experience for me in terms of brown eyeshadow. Like, I've never had a very like amicable relationship with the color brown on my eyes, because I always thought it looked really boring. It kind of blends with my own eye color and it just really wasn't doing anything for me until the shade Amber came into my life. That is the shadow over here at the very top of the palette. This is the most beautiful warm toned brown and I just loved wearing this shade. I still love wearing this shade. When I pull out this palette, more often than not I am going to pull it out to do a look with the color Amber, and I actually love to pair this eyeshadow palette with the Urban Decay Shadow Box, because I like to put those pops of colors in my inner corner to pair with the neutral tones in here. The next one is Show Your Most Colorful palette. Now, my most colorful palette has to be the Juvia's Place Magic palette, because when I open this palette, I'm like, just literally the whole rainbow is in here. You got orange, you got pink, you got the gold, you got the green, the purple, the blue. There's just every single color that I can think of is in this eyeshadow palette. I to this day very much enjoy this palette, even though it looks a little bit like a hot mess in terms of color combination. But if you like think of it as like sort of like the warm toned eyeshadow palette and the cool toned eyeshadow palette, you can appreciate this palette for the versatility that it provides you. And it was also the reason I bought this palette as my first one from Juvia's Place, because I wanted to experience as many of the tones as possible. Show Your Smallest palette. Oh, this was a really easy one. This has to be the USB stick that I have from Natasha Denona. This is the mini gold eyeshadow palette that I bought sort of on a whim, because I have the original gold palette and I thought I love the original so much I might as well get the mini, because I think they would pair beautifully, and I really enjoy that there are somewhat greener tones in here which I'm missing in the gold palette. I'm sort of going to merge the next two questions because my answer to both of them is the same palette. So the next two are Show Your Palette with the Best Memory and Show a Palette Worth the Hype. And for me, that is the Natasha Denona Gold palette. I had heard so much about this palette and I had lost it after it for such a long time and convinced myself out of buying it like a number of times. And then one day the gold palette just kind of showed up at my doorstep because my gorgeous, beautiful, amazing friend Bia decided to get it for me as a present. And I love this palette because it is a present from her and I will cherish it forever and ever, but I also think it is totally worth the hype. This is probably the most hyped palette from Natasha Denona, and honestly it is worth every penny, it is worth every hype word that it has ever received. It is gorgeous. I can easily see this palette also dethroning the Naked Heat palette as my everyday palette, because every time I pull this palette out and I just put two eyeshadows, I'm always like blown away by how beautiful it looks like just with these two eyeshadows. So this is definitely a super versatile, really beautiful, I don't know, totally worth the hype. I cannot really say enough good things about it. And on the opposite spectrum, Show Palette Not Worth the Hype. I thought about this really deeply, and unfortunately I don't really have a palette in my collection that I think is not worth the hype. I have a lot of eyeshadow palettes, but I am very selective when it comes to what I purchase, so most of the time I end up purchasing products that I really enjoy. So I wouldn't say that I have an eyeshadow palette in my collection that is not worth the hype, so unfortunately I cannot really answer this question. Show your favorite palette from a favorite brand. Now, You guys probably think I'm going to show you one of my Pat McGrath palettes, but I decided to go a different route with this one because I wanted to show you an eyeshadow palette from a brand that I used to adore, that is definitely my favorite from them, and that I don't really hear anyone talking about anymore, but I still really enjoy. Once upon a time I used to be obsessed with Urban Decay and everything they release. Unfortunately the past couple of years that hasn't been the case. I'm not really sure what happened with Urban Decay, but their releases have been very uninspired from my perspective for the past couple of like 2 or 3 years. So even though we are on a break at the moment, this is my favorite eyeshadow from them. This is the Moondust eyeshadow palette, which came out 5 years ago? 6 years? No, 4. So let's put this palette into context. It was released at a time where Pat McGrath eyeshadows didn't exist, topper shades weren't a thing, really glittery eyeshadows also weren't really that much of a thing and weren't mass-produced by every brand. And then Urban Decay came out with this beautiful, gorgeous formula, which is their Moondust formula, which is a very glittery type of formula, and then they came out with this eyeshadow palette. And let me tell you, this is beautiful, this is gorgeous. To this day, I really love using this eyeshadow palette. I love each and every eyeshadow in here, and they're still sparkly, they're still gorgeous, they're absolutely beautiful as topper shades and as standalone shades, and this is to date my favorite palette from Urban Decay. Oh fuck. Okay, the last one is also one that I can't answer for the very same reason that I don't have an everyday palette. Show your most used palette. Again, I don't really have a most used palette because I love using all of them and I like to switch it up. So there's really no palette in my collection that I can show you that has a lot of pans in it. It just never happens to me that I stick to one eyeshadow palette for a really long time. The longest I will like pull out an eyeshadow palette for is like 2 days in a row, and then I will immediately switch up to something different. So unfortunately I cannot really answer that question either. But with that being said, I think this was a really fun tag to do. I tag every one of you who has a YouTube channel and would like to do this tag. I tag all of you in the comments to let me know what you would answer to some of these questions. I can't ask you to take the time of your day to answer all of these. Let's talk about our favoriting eyeshadow palettes in the comment section below. As usual, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you would like to see more of me, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!